So now you have all these acquisitions going on, Microsoft most notably. How does that change the market?
Games communication, I think Twitter is still the biggest. And besides that, it heavily depends on the project.
When I think of people who look at reviews for games, right? People look at critic reviews, they always kind of take it with a grain of salt. And then you also have player reviews, which I think people ignore a lot of the times as well, because they feel like games are either being bombed or they're not being genuine, or the biggest critics are the only ones who are going to kind of tune into that conversation. So do people care about reviews? And if they do, kind of what do you think they more give credence to when they're looking at them?
So from my point of perspective, there was an interesting change in the industry in the last years. If you look back, like I think 10 years, most of the critic reviews were what people actually based their impressions of games on when it came to games they have never played themselves. Especially when the shift started happening from print media to online media, the print media was like still opinion king. And right now, if I look at the recent game launches, I see that people are very hyped about review scores. They love the scores, they love to judge a game by a number. They most likely don't really dive into where the number comes from. Like, what does a 7 mean? Is a 7 based on the game itself? Is a 7 based on the game in its genre compared to other games of the genre? So I think like the whole Discord shifted a bit towards checking out the number, and then they most likely get their impressions from like live streams or content creators on YouTube and Twitch. I feel like what the critics actually say about the game doesn't count as much anymore as the number they give out.
For indie developers, I think the early stage of development is the most important part. It's evolved so much over the last couple of years, and there's so much market saturation, and there's so many games out there nowadays. So with the early stage of development kind of being the most important part, for you guys specifically, when you look at that, how do you approach it? How do you plan for it?
A piece of advice for indie developers I have, or the first thing I look at when we get a pitch from an indie developer, is that I check the market. Like, I check what genre the game is set in, if it's a popular genre, and what are roughly the numbers of sales that are to be expected. And from then on, I check what the audience expects of a game. Like, what are key features inside that genre that people just expect to be there, and what are the priorities of things they want to experience. When it comes to creating games, like in general, the number one thing we look for is passion. We have some projects that are mainly driven by just one person, but it's all about one person being able to translate their own passion into the creation of the game, because this passion hopefully means that they are not only passionate about the game they're making, they are passionate about the genre they're making the game in as well, and then they're just like natural experts.
Yeah. You know, for Deck 13, you guys do publishing as well. How has that part of the industry changed over the last couple of years? Because there are so many indie games nowadays. I mean, I think it's 30 plus are releasing on Steam daily.
Yeah.
I mean, there's thousands and thousands of devs like all over the world that are pushing their games out, whether they're solo, whether there's a couple people on the team, whether there's like 15. It's a massive, massive part of the industry right now. So I would imagine from a publishing standpoint, or even from, you know, where you guys are at with Atlas Fallen, how does that impact what you do on the publishing side and what you do on the development side of things?
The only thing you could do is make sure that you cover your base. If you release a game and you have the option to release it on multiple platforms, or you at least think about releasing it on multiple platforms, the best idea you can have is that you simultaneously release it on all platforms. The time your game releases is the time where the most eyes will be on it, in terms of storefront visibility, in terms of like coverage from different outlets, news outlets. Never ever can your wishlist number be high enough. Make sure that you push it as crazy as possible. And also, there's not a bad time to start with marketing. I've spoken to lots of teams that were like, we're just trying to like finish this part of the game, and then we will start to post on Twitter about it. You can show the entire process on Twitter. Like, don't limit yourself because you think you need to reach a certain quality before showing anything. You can never start early enough with marketing, surely.
For you, what is your viewpoint on kind of social media and how to maneuver from a marketing standpoint?
So when it comes to X specifically, I think the case is right that there are mostly developers talking to developers, but there are also streamers checking out what's happening, and these are your aggregators you're looking for if you can get them interested. If the content creator interacts with your posts, then obviously it might be shared with the magical algorithm gods of X. Maybe it might be shared to their following, right? So that's of course a key demographic to be targeted. So I think there's a lot of value to be found in for like games communication, I think Twitter is still the biggest. And besides that, it heavily depends on the project. Like there's no blueprint for perfect social media strategy. What I've seen is that these new things like TikTok or YouTube Shorts, they can have an insane power to push your stuff to people that have never heard of you before. These algorithms, absolutely magical, no idea how they work. But I uploaded a TikTok clip and that got like 350,000 views without any indication. There's nothing I can pinpoint that is different from all the other stuff I posted there. But sometimes the gods just let you ascend to heaven quickly for a second. You can get a good taste of what it's like to be popular. And this might just be the push for your game to actually find an audience.
I've heard some developers say to me that they love using TikTok, but the problem with TikTok, the problem I've seen as well on my end, is that as you push your projects through TikTok, you get great impressions at times. You get great viewership
but no conversion.
Exactly. You don't get conversions, or you can't see where people are coming from. Like, you don't have that ROI. Is there a way to maneuver past that for you, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's what I was saying, that it's important to like branch out to pretty much all the platforms you think are good for your game. Because of course, I think TikTok is good for like general visibility and it's good for like general brand awareness, I would say. But the conversion, as you said, is terrible. Sometimes conversion also happens if you like hit the nerve. Like Twitter is a way better platform for conversions. And I think that's right now, it's the biggest challenge, especially given the oversaturation. If you look at the release of Atlas Fallen, we are a double A game, which means that we don't have 100 million of budget. We have between 10 to 20 million for our game, which is a lot by German standards, but compared to the big players, it's rookie numbers, right? If you then try to find a release date, so quickly, release dates, how do release dates happen? You finish the game in production timeline, and then you try to see more or less where's the good point to drop the project. Some studios have the luxury of sitting on their project for another year and polishing it just to hit a good timing. As a AA developer, you don't have that. It needs to go out now that we can start working on fixing stuff that might be broken on release and then move on to the next project. So first up, we were scheduled to release 6 days after Tears of the Kingdom. Looking back at the Tears of the Kingdom release, it was a wise choice to move the game, take the extra time to do like German voiceover, do co-op polishing. Suddenly, once we announced August 10th was our release date, Baldur's Gate said, well, our PC version is nice, we just release it a month early. And when our game came out, the visibility, like on the social media platforms, by reviewers, people posting like tricks and tips articles, they were just all set on Baldur's Gate. There was no visibility to be found. 3 weeks after that, Starfield happened. So it is really, really hard right now, even for games that have multi-million-dollar budgets, to find audiences, because there are always bigger fishes that will just take up audience attention entirely. 2023, amazing year for games. Not so much an amazing year if you're trying to release a mid-sized game yourself.
I was going to say maybe winter, but then you think of MW3 comes out in November, I think. So that kind of takes up that entire month. And then you go to December, and December is kind of, December, I've always heard people say December to like February is kind of a dead time for developers. And it's a bad period to release your game in.
I think that there is a time at the end of January until the ending of February where it's pretty much really hard to release a game, but not impossible.
It's an interesting perspective, I think, because you need to have the right timing, but you also need to have the right genre, I think, nowadays, too. For you specifically, for your guys' titles, you've released games in years past, you released Atlas Fallen this year. As audiences evolve, right, their tastes change, what they expect changes, the features that are going to be involved in these games, those change and evolve as well. So from a macro perspective, as you look at that audience over the last like 5 years, how has it changed and kind of how have you adjusted to that change?
I think most noticeably for me is that people, when the game starts, they expect to be instantly included in the core gameplay loop. Like the whole idea of having slow story introduction, that this happened for like the bigger games. If you go into Hogwarts Legacy, for example, you have seen the marketing trailers, you know that you're going to explore all of Hogwarts. You don't care if there's like an hour of dialogue at the beginning, because you know you will just explore Hogwarts in an hour. So they know what to expect and they can endure that. Same goes for like something like Horizon, because you know you will fight dinosaurs later on, right? These big titles have these big expectations that go along with them. And if you are making a game, releasing a game that people are not so invested in, you have to get them into the core loop as fast as possible. And for Atlas Fallen, initially the game started in an area where you were part of a caravan, and that caravan was attacked, and then you started to meet the people. And we did some playtests, and we noticed, I think we need to get people in more quickly, right? So we reworked the beginning of the game, and there's now like a combat intro where you get the first impression of the mechanics. Later, like you fight with bigger weapons, you have crazy air jumps and whatnot, and then you go to the beginning. But still, judging by the metrics of 2023, that is not enough. People just want to get in even more quickly. And maybe that's also part of the genre, right? Because action games, gameplay is just more important than ever. Gameplay is king. And there are people that will not care about your world, not care about the characters you invested time in. They want to skip every cutscene, and you just need to give it to them.
Yeah.
That's the conditioning that makes it really, really hard for developers to sit people down, explain the world to them, then let them go into the gameplay mechanics one by one. They just want to be in there. They want to do crazy stuff every like 30 seconds, and that's the reality right now, I think.
I think with TikTok especially, you're right. I mean, people are scrolling, you don't like it, on to the next, 5 TikToks later, all of a sudden, you're right, you get that dopamine hit, and you're like, oh, that's it. This is the perfect one, right? And that's something that it's segued into gaming, in my opinion. It's segued into all assets of this industry, where it's like, if you don't like it right away, within 5 seconds, on to the next one. That goes for YouTube videos, games, whatever it may be. And that's what kind of drew me into Atlas Fallen, because it's a story-driven game. It has a lot of dialogue that has a very rich context to the game. But for players, I think nowadays there's definitely a place for that. But it's something that is, I don't want to say niche, but it's something that is not as mainstream as it used to be, right? With that in mind, with the player bases in mind, was that something that you guys were nervous with when you were creating this game, like keeping players immersed, keeping them engaged?
At least for me, there needs to be some sort of reason for what I'm doing. Surely I can go and punch a big monster, and this might make sense if the core gameplay is nice. But even for, if you take a look at something like Monster Hunter, which is not really comparable in how it plays with Atlas Fallen, but you go punch big monsters to get their loot to like upgrade your character, right? And I think if there's a reason to do that, for example, in Monster Hunter, it's all about like getting the nice armors and weapons and whatnot. If there's a reason, they will do it, but it needs to make some sense in terms of a storytelling perspective. So for Atlas Fallen, we looked at it and said, okay, we did more or less linear games in the past. Search 1 was pretty much, you have a one path in like typical stamina-based action RPG. You have like branching paths inside the level, but there's mostly like more or less one route, right?
Yeah.
So for Search 2, we tried to load it up a bit, but it was still pretty linear. And for Atlas Fallen, we said, the idea is we don't have an open world, we have bigger levels, and inside these levels, people can freely do what they want. And that means they could also freely engage with the story whenever they choose to do it, right? So of course, there are bottlenecks, there are story bottlenecks before you like progress to the next area.
Yeah.
And these are parts where, of course, you have to engage with the story. But besides that, you are free to explore and do whatever you want. And for the people that don't want story because they want to fight big monsters, that is kind of playground we try to design for them, to give them more or less more agency on when to do what, to move away from the linear storytelling we did in the past.
I think there's two sides to the coin, to your point. Like, I think with story-driven games, I've heard a lot of people over the last couple of years say that they're getting more popular, that there's a resurgence in them, which I believe is probably the case. I mean, I think people are looking for that to a degree. But then I hear people using things like God of War as an example. Like, God of War's story was amazing and the game was great. I don't take anything away from God of War. I think the gameplay was amazing. I think the story was good. I also think it was God of War. And I think God of War had an audience that was built into it before it even launched, and people were very excited about that game. And that's why it was as popular as it was. And then the other side of the coin is Call of Duty, when they took the story out of their game. Very few people play Call of Duty anymore for the story. They play it for the multiplayer, and that's just the case. So taking that away, it doesn't take away from the game. It doesn't change the game. It just reinforces players who want to play multiplayer. To that point, I mean, you have some very interesting gameplay mechanics in this title. Like, the sand surfing mechanic jumped out to me. I thought it was really, really cool. So for you guys, when you made this game, I'd imagine there's a lot of technical difficulties when you're implementing something like that. So as you built this game, with that, with all the other mechanics you put into this thing, how did you build that out, and how did you kind of build that with players in mind?
When it comes to like the exploration part, for example, this was insane because we have a double jump, we have an air dash that you upgrade to like 3 levels, and we have weapon moves that propel you through the air. So building levels for these mechanics that you are scoping out and implementing and prototyping. Meanwhile, level designers start building levels. Suddenly the gameplay mechanic changes, the air dash goes a bit farther.
Yep.
That means level designer need to adjust every jumping segments. They just built this was like a crazy iterative design process, and especially shout outs to all people working in quality assurance at Deck 13, because we found so many ways to get like the extra bit of speed or like height to just skip entire parts of the level. This was crazy QA work for sure.
So now you have all these acquisitions going on, Microsoft most notably. How does that change the market of the gaming industry? I mean, how does that impact 10 years from now? What players are going to see? What is that change going to be?
I think the super big wave of acquisitions 2 years ago, roughly, that's when I started to think, oh, this might be industry changing, especially looking at the idea that Microsoft is trying to disrupt the way games are being acquired with the Game Pass. They have managed to create a system that people just pay for monthly, and they pay a fraction of the cost they would pay for a single player game when they acquired, right? So short term, also taking into account that the economic situation is not an easy one because games are an absolute good of luxury. So short term, it's a very hard industry, and I think that the studios closing we see right now is something I think is for the short-term future, something we see more of, sadly. And long-term, I am very interested to see what the subscription model does. And if we speak about console wars, even if at the moment people still think that PlayStation is winning every console generation and whatnot, I think the smart choice, future-oriented choice is made by Microsoft at the moment, especially given that the game prices are rising right now. It's not $60 for a game anymore. As I said, the Game Pass for a fraction of the price. Why wouldn't you just play the games there? Looking towards the small indies, they will have a very, very hard time to get visibility. Like, as I said earlier, you can never start early enough with marketing. This will be more important in the future, that you need to get your voice out there. You need to find your audience early. You need to keep them invested for the process of development. And I think it's also more likely that indie games need to work with a publisher that has the expertise because they worked with previous titles that are similar and have a good way to connect with the audience. Have you ever seen the Indie Game the Movie, I think it was called, back in 2012?
Was
the
that
documentation about Super Meat Boy?
No, I haven't seen that one.
It's a super interesting watch coming from now. It was released, I think, in 2012, and it followed the release on Xbox Live or Xbox Arcade of Super Meat Boy and Faz, which was like a jumping puzzle platformer. These were like more or less the first indie games. They were not as early as Minecraft was earlier, but it was the same time where stuff like Minecraft took off and people were just playing it. If you look at it now, how these people were able to get a ton of visibility, and especially like Super Meat Boy was super popular back then, it's not like that anymore. These times are over. You really need to fight for visibility. Stuff like Braid, for example, another indie game that happened around that time. This is a game, if it was released today, no one would notice. I think it's a very interesting watch to go back and check out that movie and see how fast the industry developed. How indie games were weird and different back then, but now are the norm and very hard to get an audience for.
To your point, PlayStation has tried to make their own version of Game Pass. I forget what it's called. It launched last year, but...
Is it a real competitor?
Yeah, it's not. And the problem, and I talked about this was in the version of Steam with somebody recently, where I was asking if there's ever going to be a competitor for Steam that gets to that level, right? Because Epic tried and they just never got close. And a lot of other websites or platforms have tried and they've just never gotten close, because Steam they've got their audiences, they've got their libraries, they are in a position of luxury right now because they're in the lead, and they're so far in the lead that I don't think anybody stands a chance to ever get close to them in the near future. And I think Xbox is very similar with Game Pass. They have had it set up. It is in its own position right now where it has that game library, it has an audience, and it has a reputation, which is very important nowadays. And I just don't think anybody's going to touch them for the next 5 years, if not longer. I just don't think anybody's even close right now. And PlayStation is the best competitor, but they just don't have it right now. It's is a very different animal. And I think, to your point, when you're saying games are going up, prices are going up, making games is going up as well, which is another reason I think why those acquisitions are happening, because all these different games, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They need more and more developers, and they just can't find them. Like, they're just not out there anymore. So they acquire these studios, they bring them into the fold, and they let them kind of work on their projects and try to enhance their projects. Because you're not just releasing a game anymore, right? You're releasing a game and then you're supporting it for 5 years or whatever. So it's just, there's so much going on. And I do worry about indie developers in the next 5 years, 10 years. I mean, because I don't know, there's so many of them, and they make shit money, and they put out great titles, and they have this fresh take on the industry that AAA can't afford to take because they can't make those risks.
I think as a consumer, you don't need to be worried. You will still have plenty of amazing indie games to choose from.
It's a positive mindset. I like that.
Yeah, as a consumer.
Yeah.
But not as an indie developer. That's where it gets grim, because if you develop a game right now that would have been perceived by people as a 10 out of 10 10 years ago, an indie game, this will now be something they call mid-game. It's a vocabulary I used earlier on in this episode, ironically, but it's actually a thing that, it's just mid-game. So the point I'm trying to make is the quality of a game like 10 years ago, the expectations people had for the quality of a game 10 years ago is different from now. Right now, if you make an excellent game, it might be average compared to all the other excellent games arriving at the moment. So only the things that are like really top-notch, polished, things like Sea of the Star right now, they will get their audience and they will get their visibility. And the others have to fight for it. And maybe the industry needs to find ways where it's not all about like the first day sales. I think that's what Games as a Service tried to do, right? That they said, okay, if I don't sell well on day one, there's another content pack coming in 3 months. Maybe I sell then, and they try to do the break-even process, but they're stretched out over years. I think that doesn't work for single-player games, but I think something needs to change because it's not sustainable right now. It's pretty much more or less a coin flip when you release a game. The chances will get worse in the future, in the near future.
Your odds aren't going to get better. I agree with that completely. Atlas Fallen, though, right? So it's a story-driven game, linear title. Looking into 2024 and beyond, how do you see this game and then everything after this game kind of evolving from there with the market, with the industry, with the player base, and with the feedback you've gotten from this game?
When it comes to main takeaways for future games, I think what really worked was the exploration, the freedom in the movement, and the overall verticality to it. And I will die on that hill to keep my company pursuing the way of keeping verticality in the game, because it's mighty important, at least for me. I think what we also nailed with Atlas Fallen, and what will hopefully stick, is the Deck 30 DNA, as I coined it. The idea that you have different body parts that you can target, that you can cut off, and then create something out of it. I hope that sticks, but that's just my personal wish. I will try to also force it to throw down throat of my team. But the whole approach to having less linearity, I think that's just something that needs to happen for games in the future right now. That people have totally different priorities. And if you produce a game for the mass market, the broader market, right, then you need to take into account that player types are very different. They are looking for a different experience. And if you try to catch as many of them, you need to give them as much freedom to put the priorities where their preferences.
You mentioned, the mass market and players as a whole. When I think about the indie market, right, just kind of as a broader spectrum, I think a lot of indie developers, they start off with platformers, like side-scroll platformers. Like, that's one of the main places they go to. From you looking in, right, and I know that every genre in gaming is packed with games being released daily, but is that a smart avenue to take as a developer? Is that something you would think, like, from mass exposure, people getting, there's attention coming to your title, people want to buy it? Is that a good place to start? I understand it's a good place to start for developers because from a core mechanic standpoint, from a development standpoint, it's more streamlined and straightforward, and it's easier to understand. It's a good starting point. I get that completely. But from a marketing standpoint, from the outside looking in, is that the best place to start? Or should developers push the limits and try different genres other than that?
So one thing when you ask a developer at the end of a project is, we did it like that. based on your knowledge now, would you now still do it the same way? And the answer is most likely never yes. So that means there's a big learning process of the project. Even if they ship like 5 games, there's still a big learning process. And the amount of stuff you learn during a project might get smaller, but it's still like there's still something new. So just looking at all the experience you could gather before that, it helps you to just learn less because you already know what you're doing. Looking at this specifically, my advice would be, if you have an idea for an amazing game, something you've dreamed of since you were a child, don't put everything on that. Don't even start with that would be my advice. If you want to get into like general game design, game developing itself, start with something easy. And I think that's why people start with creating platformers. I think that the angle of going into this industry to create your own game and having a commercially successful release right away, that is an insane bar to reach. Like, I'm seeing some movement in the games industry. I'm not sure if there's a term for it yet, but I think these would be, I would call them micro games. Like these experiences that are learned in like a minute or two, and you could play them for 2 hours, but you could play them also for 5 minutes. I think this is, looking back at the dopamine argument I made earlier, this is something that is very topical right now, that these projects don't have a lot of risk in terms of how long you work on it and how well it is received. If you make 3 games a year and only one of them gets a decent audience, it's not as bad as if you work on one game for 4 years and no one plays it, right? So I think there's like market-wise, there's a good case to be made to make these, and from player consumption, usual player consumption, there's a good argument made to make these. So we ourselves made I would not say it's a micro game, but we made a smaller game called Lunistis, which is it's a platformer, 3D platformer, very reminiscent of Sega Saturn titles. And it was actually made by one of our guys from the publishing label. In his free time, he just makes games as well, and he said, I will check out the publishing process from the as a developer. I will work with my own publishing label to see if you guys are cool or not from the other side.
I see.
And we published his game, and check out Lunistis if you like type platformers. It's a small game, and there is commercial room for that. It will not be the thing that will pay all your bills for the rest of your life, but it can be a cool support cash stream in your life. When you're making games, it's really hard to rely on the fact that it will sell millions of copies. If you like to take risks, sure, go ahead, but when it comes to doing your first games, make sure that you do something you're interested in, that is in scope, and is not something you get hung up for years, and if it does not work out, then it will devastate your life. I think if you can stay away from that, you are making healthy choices.
So looking from your perspective, right, to wrap everything up, to look at the industry as a whole, you're a slightly larger developer. You've made a lot of games in your past. You've been in the industry for a little bit now, or for a while now. So looking at indie developers that are just starting out, right, looking at the industry as a whole, what's some advice you would give them? What's some things you would tell them on how to approach the market, how to approach their games, how to approach development, all of it? Kind of what's some advice you would give them right out the gate?
In the industry from the inside for 4 years now. So based on these experiences, I've seen launches that were amazing, where people were more or less millionaires within a week. But I've seen releases where people had an issue to pay for their general livelihood, right? So my suggestion would be, apart from all the financial parts, that you keep your mental health in check and are aware what this industry is able to do with your head, because it will fuck in different ways with your head, and you need to be aware of that. It will be especially when you're indie developer, games just have a way to be the center of your life, and that's something you actively need to be aware of and kind of, in my opinion, push back on. Because the passion you have and the commitment you have, these are amazing tools, and I think you need to wield them to make an amazing game. But these are also the tools that drag you into the swamp of being invested too much. It still resonates with me when people send us emails and say, hey, I'm going through a tough time right now, and this game is helping me to just get through it, to keep distracted. So as a developer, you're creating something that helps people escape reality. And the thing you are creating has the tendency to drag you in and just try to be a bit like the people that are using your games to escape something. Try to find something yourself that is also occupying you, so the game does not become the center of your life. Because as I said, industry is developing towards the point flip, and the outcome is not favored your way, so it might crash horribly. You need to be aware of that and especially protect your mind from it.
It's something that developers definitely need to keep in mind, is mental health, keeping a healthy approach to their games, understanding how demanding the market is, and just keeping expectations in check. So there's two sides to that coin, right? Where like you definitely need to prioritize yourself and make sure that you're okay. But then you also need to think about there's going to be consequences ultimately for something like that. And it's just whether you're okay with living with that and whether you're okay with building your product your way, right? And understanding the limitations that will come with that.
I like optimism very much, but at the end of the day, I'm pragmatic, I'm realistic, and I just want for people to be happy and not set themselves up for failure. Keep your expectations in check, be humbled. Don't be humbled by the release itself, be humbled before you approach the release.
Right, yeah.